All right, we are back with We Don't Need No, starting with Alan, who has a Texas law.
A Texas law and some commentary from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, the Republican Party's favorite second-tier candidate for the 2024 presidential election. He's very good at these little publicity stunts. And his latest one, let's see if he actually backs it up with any concrete action, but was to appear on some show, the Joe Pags show, in which he is providing some post Roe v. Wade commentary. This time, he's talking about a decision from the Supreme Court called Plyler versus Doe, which concerned a Texas law that the Supreme Court overturned in 1982. And that law, that Texas law, was denying state funding to children who were not, quote, legally admitted to the United States. So this is another one of those Republican Party, in particular, Greg Abbott's attempts to politicize undocumented immigration, and in this case, to deny any kind of education to kids who may have been brought to the U.S. at a very, very young age by their parents, but were never formally documented or formally immigrated. And so this one actually has a pretty consequential impact on thousands and thousands of children potentially. But apparently this also has something to do with the 14th Amendment and this ruling on Roe v. Wade. I'm not clear on all the legalities, but if Roe v. Wade is overturned, then somehow that provides some legal underpinning to change this Plyler versus Doe decision also.
Yes.
Which is consistent with, I think, a lot of legal action that's going to happen after Roe v. Wade.
Yes, I've been hearing a lot of commentary about this. And what's interesting is, of course, the right-wingers are technically right that the Roe versus Wade decision and a bunch of others are all based on this sort of creative extension of rights that weren't in the Constitution to sort of invent others by sort of these tenuous extensions. And like they also said, the decision that you have to have Miranda warnings, the cops have to tell you you have the right to remain silent, that was also rested on a similar tenuous extension beyond what those written in the Constitution. And but the Miranda ruling was not overturned, even though exactly the same criticisms were brought up about it, because the Supreme Court at the time, the Chief Justice said, this does appear to be an unjust ruling by a previous Supreme Court, but it's been that way for decades, and we ought to just respect precedent. And that's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said about Roe versus Wade when it was first passed, is it was too broad, it was too tenuous, they should have made a more gentle, smaller move. And I didn't realize this until I read these commentaries, but apparently it is well known that frequently the Supreme Court makes outrageous wrong rulings, and yet, once they've been around for a while, it is traditional to not overturn them completely, but to just make small adjustments because people have gotten used to them. They built businesses, they built lives around the way things are, and you don't just rock the boat drastically for no reason, or you'll end up diminishing people's trust in the system. And that's what they're all talking about. It's this drastic move of pulling Roe versus Wade back all suddenly and so completely, and toppling many things, like basically all the civil rights legislation since the 60s, seems to be an unnecessary disruption of our society. And I didn't realize this. I've heard these arguments. I didn't realize how much the Supreme Court bases its judgments not on the letter of the law, but on their estimate of what this is going to do to society.
Yes, I've really come to a greater appreciation of just how political the Supreme Court is, and also how this past precedent is like a Jenga tower of interpretations and political wins and maybe the personal whims of various justices, and how you just remove one ruling like Roe v. Wade and the whole thing might come toppling down.
But I'm generally in favor of not making drastic changes, because this reminds me of San Francisco wanting to take all the names of all the historical figures off the schools and tear down statues of people like Abraham Lincoln because we decided to cancel him. I mean, the fact is, we're all here because of past generations that did stuff that is now considered terrible, and yet that is what we rest on. So it doesn't make sense to cancel everything that is no longer fashionable.
Well, I have to say that it's a poor analogy to compare San Francisco's renaming of schools, which was a politically inadvisable maneuver, and say overturning Roe v. Wade. We're talking about entirely different magnitudes of significance here.
Oh, I'm not
And
so sure.
also,
I mean, they want to rename schools because they basically want to amend history and change these heroes into villains, which I think amounts to a similar change in the culture.
well, I don't think this is the two are really at all comparable or relevant. What we're talking about here is a question of justice and of equal rights. It's really what it comes down to. We're not talking about cancel culture. We're not talking about various culture war topics. We're talking about how do we make America a just and equitable country and society.
Well,
And the fact of the matter is that historically America was not a just and equitable society. And in fact, it still isn't today. And if anything, this ruling, this Roe v. Wade being overturned, is going to send us even farther back into the past, which is entirely consistent with the reactionary rights agenda. That's exactly what they want. They want to return to some hypothetical or romanticized past. That's what originalism, constitutional originalism, is all about. It's all about trying to imagine what the founding fathers had in mind for the country and trying to return us to some purer past state.
well, see, I understand what you're saying, but I do not agree, because I think it is wrong to have an absolutist position on either side and say, we must totally legalize abortion to have more freedom, and we must totally end it to be more true to the original vision of the founders. I think what we have is a compromise. What we had was a compromise. You could have abortion up until 20 weeks, but not after that, something like that. And what they were trying to do is move it to 15 weeks. So what we had was not either side's pure moral position, but just some sort of uneasy compromise in the middle that satisfied nobody. And the right thing for the Supreme Court to do would be to just move the needle down a little, like from 20 to 15. That would be the kind of, because I think that's what you have to do in a pluralistic democracy like this. The fact is, neither side can have 100% of what they want. So you have to choose a ridiculous position in the middle that satisfies no pure morals.
No, I don't think that's true at all, because compromise still can perpetuate injustice.
Oh, absolutely. Both sides will scream that the current situation is unjust. And that's what counts as success in politics.
I mean, that's what I've been saying for a long time. I mean, on the one hand, I have neighbors who are, who are African American, who are strong advocates for racial justice. On the other hand, I actually live near a trailer park, and there's actually some KKK members living in that trailer park. And I'm always saying, you got to find compromise, come together and find some middle ground, so.
Well, that does pretty much summarize the current American situation.
But for people at home who don't understand sarcasm, I am I'm poking Sam's argument. I'm not serious.
I get no respect. That's what I get.
Yeah, no, the fallacy. There's a fallacy, and there's a specific name for this logical fallacy. I think it's the fallacy of the middle or something, where the idea is that the truth always lies in the middle. Now, Sam does have a valid point that in a democracy, compromises have to be made, and no one is going to be completely happy, and that can be great for a lot of things where there's no right or wrong, course of action. Like, how much do we want to be taxed? And how much do we want our money to go to different services? Yeah, there's going to be compromises there because there's no right or wrong answer. But sometimes in society, there are right and wrong answers, like whether or not we should treat people with dignity and respect. In particular, should we treat women with dignity and respect? And one of the things that we can do to treat women with dignity and respect is to give all women and or anyone who can give birth for that matter, access to reproductive health, including abortions.
Well,
So.
the argument of the right is that there is another party here, the unborn child, that might perhaps deserve some consideration. And that's why I do not think there's an absolute moral right here.
No, so the moral right, Sam, is not that, is not whether or not abortions are right or wrong. The absolute right is that we give women the ability to choose for themselves whether or not to make this decision.
Well, people argue that women shouldn't have the freedom to terminate a pregnancy at like 8 months. And some people even argue that the father is a stakeholder and has some rights. And some people even argue that the state is a stakeholder and has some rights in how the children come about to be born. And I think those arguments do not have zero weight.
They don't, but like I said, let's focus on the arguments that are sort of absolute, which is, like I said, you can argue whether or not you think a zygote deserves rights. They don't. But you can argue, it, and you can make a philosophical argument.
It's not a matter of science or principle. You just have to choose a position. You have to choose some particular point at which they have some rights, and that's what we've done. We decided it's 20 weeks based on essentially nothing.
Right. I mean, but the thing is, like I said, what you want to do is find out what positions are not up for debate. Like I said, being treated with dignity is not up for debate.
Sure, but the problem,
how to get abortions, how to do it correctly, what's the best course of action to get an abortion. Yeah, that's all up to debate. But like I said, civil rights are not something you can compromise on, right? Either you're treated with dignity in a society or you're not.
Oh, but
and by completely
after you commit a crime, you're totally no longer treated with dignity.
You are not, because you violated someone else's civil rights.
Well, a lot of crimes are a whole lot less clear than that, like drug offenses. They don't appear to hurt anybody. So, I mean, I just think there's a whole lot of these issues where any absolute moral position is ridiculous. And the fact is, you have competing stakeholders that cannot both be satisfied.
But like I said, that is a common logical fallacy to believe that the truth is always in the middle. It's not.
Oh, I don't think there's any truth here at all.
But
This
see,
is
that's
political expediency.
Well, like I said, once again, that's the same fallacy where, truth is entirely, subjective, and therefore, one side believes X and one side believes Y, and therefore, as a society, we should just come somewhere in the center. That's just not always the case.
No, I think it is just an arbitrary decision. You can make various choices and they will lead to different outcomes. So you choose what kind of society you want to live in.
I can agree with that statement. I mean, you do. Do we want to live in a society where we treat people with respect or not? I mean,
well, I think that's why I'm probably getting conservative in my old age, as is typical. I think the fact is you should make small course corrections and not kick the underparting over and just throw everything into chaos, which is what Roe did and what removing Roe does. That's why I like this.
So would you agree that, say, during the middle of the 20th century, there were a lot of Jim Crow laws, right? There were a lot of laws that were unjust, that targeted people of color.
Yeah.
And there was a huge civil rights movement that really rocked the boat, Do you think maybe they should have been a little slower about it, not rocked it so much all at once? I mean,
I don't know. It may have been necessary at that time. That was relatively successful. The one before it, the Civil War, was incredibly wasteful and unsuccessful. Mm-hmm. So this is very tough. And that's why a bunch of people are trying to start another civil war, and they're quite open about it. And I'm very much against that. I would rather have a more gradual, less violent change.
Yeah, I want to hear from Alan.
Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. Sam, you say that you want to have gradual change.
At least avoid violence.
Mm-hmm. To avoid violence. So your goal is to avoid conflict, essentially.
Oh, well, at least to limit the conflict. Yeah.
Limit the conflict. So what is acceptable conflict?
Well, I'm not sure. I would say in general, you should hold it down to the minimum possible, but there's always going to be quite a bit in these political matters.
The goal is to minimize conflict.
Well, That's not the only goal, of course.
What are some of the other goals then?
Well, I personally would like to see more freedom and more respect for people, like Kaitlyn says.
You don't perhaps detect any conflicts in your position.
Oh, no, there's certainly conflicts. All these positions are in conflict. That's my problem. That's why it's politics. Instead of coming to a clear answer like mathematics, you're just averaging many opposing forces.
Well, you just said that you wanted to avoid conflict, but it also sounds like you are somewhat interested in avoiding injustices.
Well, yes.
Okay. Now, what if the law of the land is fundamentally in conflict with the civil rights of some of its citizens? We're talking in very abstract terms. What is the correct course of action? What is the right course of action, in your opinion?
Well, then you should amend the law.
Okay, so you should amend the law. But what if there is a opposing group that wants to perpetuate some kind of injustice because it benefits them economically, or it benefits them socially in some kind of societal hierarchy?
Yes.
What then?
Yes, that summarizes the current problem in America. And then I think your choices are to split your society into two groups and split into two nations, or to let split into various states that do things differently, or to coerce the unwilling to go along with you. And then there will probably be a backlash. And we're just watching these various bad options be tried sequentially.
Well, it's an interesting argument, and you may or may not be surprised to know that it's actually a popular one in a very extreme far right, I mean, ultra nationalist, white supremacist far right circles, accelerationism, which is the belief that America is fundamentally in conflict, and that fundamentally in conflict because of the fact that it's a pluralistic, multiracial society.
Right.
And that inevitably there is going to be a race war in America.
Yeah, this was Charles
So
Manson's
the only
idea.
solution is to accelerate America down that path. And
yes, and they're doing it efficiently,
yes.
And I don't approve of it.
Okay, well, but you do realize the conflict in your previous statement with what you just said now.
Nope. I don't realize that. They're the ones trying to like move fast and break things, and I'm trying to be more gradual and hopefully not break things.
So I think my point is that sometimes you want to break things because people are trying to break you.
There are people that want to break things on both the left and the right, and I don't think either of those techniques is the best move. But it's just a judgment call. I can't prove this.
You know, when you are threatened with violence, and a lot of political ideologies end up being violent, like, and I'm not talking about, you know, being like Antifa or anything like that. I'm talking about things like anti-queer legislation, which puts a target on queer people.
Yep.
That's a form of violence, and you can't meet that sort of violence with meek, Gandhi-like pacifism. Unfortunately, you really do have to stand up for yourself, and you have to, you know, put your foot down about what's right and about, like I said, human dignity. Really having a no compromise position when it comes to treating people with respect.
I think Gandhi-like pacifism gets a bad rap. I think it works out a lot more than people think.
I think there's a lot of people on the right who would agree with that, or not on the right, I would say on the extreme right, who would actually agree with that statement, Sam.
You do not seem to be using that technique.
No, I mean, they would absolutely agree that I mean, if you watch a lot of right-wing media, they get incensed over all the very flamboyant and active, you know, Black Lives Matter, you know, protesters. Wow. They get very incensed over all the people that are like Antifa, who really had never done anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't count them as violent. That's just street theater, and that's harmless.
Yeah, exactly. But like I said, the passivism from your opposing side, if you're like in the KKK, is one of your best assets. And being willing to, like I said, have a hard line drawn in the sand about what is acceptable, to how to treat other people and not, is morally imperative for a pluralistic society like ourselves.
I guess. Have you got more to say, Alan?
Well, I think we could go on for a while. I will say, Sam, that your logic is unsound. Your reasoning is unsound, and that your position is, as I said, fundamentally in conflict with itself, and that
Yeah, that's fair.
we're going to have to continue talking about this.
Sure, that's all fair.
To straighten this out.
No, this is
Yeah.
yes, that's my brilliant enlightenment. Is that logic is not as useful here as I once thought it would be.
Yeah, Sam, your reasoning is bad and you should feel bad.
Well, the first part may be right, but I don't feel bad about it. Anyway,
Okay.
all right, so let's go on to VPNs. So if you use a VPN, supposedly people can't see what you're doing and they can't tell who you are, except apparently that's not true at all, because there are data brokers that sell the net flow logs from the ISPs, not only to governments, but really much to anybody. One of them is Team Kimru, who sells it to people and advertise, if a bad guy is hacking your network and using a VPN, you can use this data to find out where they are. And so apparently this is one of those open secrets. And Ron Wyden, the usual guy involved in this stuff, has found out and exposed it. So it is somewhat questionable. And there's a interesting Twitter thread by Gossie the dog saying, for example, suppose you set up a VPN at Amazon and use it and think you're safe. Well, people can just buy the net flow from Amazon and see what you're doing. So most of these VPNs, they aren't really hiding you very well at all. The only thing they are do, which students brought this up in class last night, is they are protecting you from like the guy next to you in the coffee house sniffing the Wi-Fi. That they will protect you from, but they're not protecting you from people like the government and big business who can just buy the NetFlow logs and track you down. It kind of reminds me of everybody thought they could get away with doing criminal things on the Bitcoin network because nobody could trace back through the accounts, but they totally can, and they totally do. So anyway, that's another nail in the coffin of VPNs, I'd say. And then Kaitlyn is monitoring the employees.
Yeah, we are monitoring the employees. And Sam, get ready for this. Ready?
I'm ready. Oh, well, now I didn't turn that on, and yet you turned it on. Oh,
I turned it on.
You're doing it in an unusual way.
Yes, I am. So for people that are just listening to the audio, I have a new video set up so I can share the article on the screen with everybody, and actually have my head in a little corner as well.
That's cool.
So
yeah.
Anyway, so ABC News, the Australian version, the Australian broadcasting company, I imagine, so abc.net.au, has an article written by James Purtill talking about employee monitoring software, which we talked about earlier on our podcast. So during the pandemic, a lot of white-collar workers were spied on by their bosses to make sure they were actually working, because bosses are annoying like that. Especially in a few private sectors where bosses did not trust their workers to get the work done. In my experience, most people working from home, especially during COVID-19, put in way too many hours, including myself, with the large workloads, and no one was goofing off. But I'm doing, God's work, in the government, doing public service stuff, not making money for shareholders. So
You're
it might
from
be
the
different.
government. You're here to help us.
Yes, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. I'm not trying to make money for shareholders, which, some people might be dissatisfied with their jobs. Who knows? I can't speak for all white collar workers everywhere.
What could be more sacred than making money in America?
I know, right? Some people are just weird. Anyway, so people are showing go back to the office, but sales of these monitoring softwares, which will take screenshots of your desktop, which will turn on your webcam in your home without your knowledge. It will turn on your microphone without your knowledge.
Oh my God.
I mean, it just tracks the number of keystrokes you're using, your mouse movements, all that kind of stuff, just to make sure you're actually doing your job. Forget the fact that during the pandemic, one of the nice things is that if you're feeling a little down, you ate something bad, you can take an hour nap, come back to work refreshed and be more productive, whatever. Employers just want control. That's what it comes down to. And but anyway, so this article is talking about how demand for this monitoring software hasn't decreased now that people are going to the office. Just the opposite. This bossware is remaining popular even on office computers now. You can walk into a building, you can see people at their desks doing their job, yet they still have this monitoring software installed because the bosses just absolutely love it. And, obviously a bunch of people are upset about this. It's an invasion of privacy. No one wants to be monitored 24/7. And the white collar workers are just not having it. And this article continues to go on and talk about the blue collar workers who have been monitored like this forever. And they're like, really? No. Like we've been doing this for a long time. We're in our factories, we're in our warehouses, being monitored like 24/7. I mean, it's, so there's a class thing going on, some class warfare that is integral to the story. And that's pretty much it. It's legal, yes, you're being monitored, and it's becoming very popular.
I'm surprised the bosses want this. I use online course management systems at the college. It's Canvas, and it gives me the ability to click in and see like how many minutes students have been on the site and all that. And I never do it. I don't have time. I don't care. I just notice whether they do the homework. And if I was a boss, I would have the same attitude. Why do I want to know minute by minute what each employee is doing? That would just drive me nuts.
If I were a boss and I did not like one of my employees and I needed a way to fire said employee, but make it not look like it was discrimination or malpractice or anything like that, then this monitoring software could become very useful for coming up with cheap excuses to get someone off your team.
Yeah, it seems like it's just rife for abuse and not really accomplishing much good. I mean, it seems to me like what your employees are accomplishing their tasks or not in other ways. But anyway. Yeah, all right. So let's see. Then we're back to Alan with Facebook.
Yes, the Wall Street Journal has a big story concerning some whistleblowers who have reported to the US and Australian governments following the Australian Parliament's passage of a law that required Facebook to change the way it covered, or rather the way Facebook compensated news organizations for news stories that are pasted or are posted on Facebook.
I didn't know they ever paid for anything.
Well, they don't until this law passed in Australia. And apparently, while the Australian Parliament was debating this law internally, Facebook decided to apply some leverage. This, according to the whistleblowers. Facebook decided to apply some leverage and used an algorithm. This is the term. Used an algorithm to remove pages that might or might not have been non-compliant with the expected letter of the law. The law had not been passed yet, but Facebook wanted to apply some leverage to the Australian government. And what this so-called algorithm did was it took down a number of pages belonging to Facebook pages belonging to various Australian governments, departments, local governments, even public services such as nonprofits and hospitals. And so all of these different organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, were simply taken down all at once. 5 days later, the Australian Parliament does pass a law, but it is much milder. It's much less severe. And so Facebook was thereby able to get much of what it wanted. It still had to pay some money for the posting of news stories, but
So
not
essentially,
nearly as
Facebook
much.
went. So it's like Facebook went on strike, right?
Well, they didn't exactly just go on strike, though. They managed to knock off a number of organizations from their platform, and they used that as a bargaining chip.
Hmm.
Now, there are interviews with various Australian figures. One of the main regulators for this kind of thing claims that no, it wasn't. He doesn't think that Facebook really wanted to do this. It wasn't actually a intentional thing. It was just an accident. But in this Wall Street Journal report, and this is the Wall Street Journal, this is a very pro-business conservative organization owned by the Murdochs. They include screenshots of emails from Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, and Campbell Brown, an executive at Facebook, praising these actions and saying things like the thoughtfulness of the strategy, precision of execution, and ability to stay nimble as things evolve sets a new high standard. So the topmost executives in the organization knew everything about it and were totally on board with it. And it worked for them. It's just another example of how Facebook, and a few weeks ago, I talked about how Facebook executives in India made a concerted effort to favor the BJP party against the Congress party, and with substantial effects on the amount of political advertising that Indian users saw.
Mhm.
And so this is another example of Facebook using its massive advantage, shall we say, in the information space to get what it wants, to apply its own power to manipulate governments into doing things that are more advantageous to the company, but certainly not necessarily in the interest of the public, because the public didn't have access to Facebook pages from their government, their hospitals, nonprofits, etc.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure Facebook broke any laws here, but they kind of exposed themselves as being sort of ruthless and extremely powerful, enough to just shove a government around.
Yes, exactly. And Australia is not exactly a small country, and it doesn't have a weak government. So this is a substantial influence on the part of Facebook.
And I think this is why China, really crushed their tech sector, saying we really don't want you tech people getting this powerful over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And so then I got stuff about the abortion bill. So Louisiana has passed a bill and then amended it to make sure that it applies to ectopic pregnancies and IUDs, declaring that life begins not at fertilization and implantation, but merely at fertilization. And the punishment for IUDs would now be to punish the same as the punishment for murder. And ectopic, you could not be allowed to terminate ectopic pregnancies, which will kill the mother. So this is just the madness I've been talking about in my classes. This is bloody insane. I mean, people have argued about stuff like 20 weeks or 15 weeks, but not allowing abortions when the life of the mother is at risk is absolutely indefensible, I think, by anybody. And it is horrifying that the current Republican Party is going there. And this is why I see a lot of commentators saying it's very strange that after working for decades to achieve this, they are not proud of it at all. They're not bragging about it at all. They're aware of the fact that nobody actually wants this thing they have accomplished. The number of people that want that is like below 20%. And they're not going to win elections for this glorious victory on abortion. And there's a good Twitter thread from a woman explaining what happened to her pre-Roe when her mother had some kind of medical problem and couldn't give birth and had a dead fetus inside her that wouldn't come out. And therefore she needed a medical abortion and it was illegal. And she was dying in the hospital and her father had to go plead before the judge to please give them exception before she died. And the only reason they got it is because the doctor was Jewish and he threatened to resign from the hospital because apparently in Judaism, abortions to save the mother are very strongly required. And he was able to persuade the hospital and they were ultimately able to persuade the courts to grant a one-time exception here. And they said, this is the madness you go back to when you pass these extreme anti-abortion laws that go way beyond any arguable moral position. And anyway, that seems to be where we're headed. This is what troubles me. It's not that Republicans win a battle here and there. It's that the current crop of MAGA people want to go way over into crazy town and pass crazy laws that benefit nobody.
Well, I mean, this has been a long time strategy of the GOP. And at the time when it was devised, I think it made sense for them to do this. I remember talking to a lot of friends who are conservatives, and they're totally in the conservative mindset and the conservative party. But if you ask them, and when you point out that, if you were a conservative, 80 years ago, you would be against Black people having rights. You would be, and then if you were, a conservative, 20 years ago, you would think that gay people don't deserve rights and they should have AIDS. And like, no, I would never do that. I believe in equal rights. I believe in this stuff. And so once people get civil rights and people realize it becomes normal, it becomes sort of a precedent, and people who would have been against those initially, start to come around after a few decades. And I kind of feel like that's what happened with abortion. It was very strongly opposed, but over time, it's been sort of part of our society. Our society hasn't collapsed. A lot of women, including a lot of conservative women, have benefited from having this access to healthcare and respect, for that matter. But the conservatives had this like 50-year plan, and they just kept with it and kept with it and kept with it. And by the time it actually came to fruition, society had moved along.
Right. It had gone out of date. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're enforcing values that might have seemed mainstream 50 years ago, but now they seem outrageous. Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. And you got the Mars helicopter.
I do have the Mars helicopter. Let's take a look-see. Once again, magic. I even have like the screen transition and everything. Oh, I'm so professional. Anyway, so interestingengineering.com, great website title. You know exactly what you're getting when you go to interestingengineering.com. I love it. So they have an article written by Chris Young talking about how NASA's helicopter just completed its 27th flight. Yeah, it's completed 27 flights. Now, it was originally scheduled to fly like 5 times only, and then that's it. A lot of times, NASA equipment is way over-engineered because you would much rather it exceed expectations than suddenly have a problem midway through. And so you have things like rovers on Mars, which were designed to run for like 6 months, running around the planet for like a decade. And so the helicopter is still doing its flights, and it's been on quite a few by this point. And it's actually assisting with the rover's mission now. So it's going up and it's surveying the land and trying to find spots where the rover should go to and investigate, which is very interesting because this means that in future missions, this could be a sort of standard asset. Like you send a rover and you send a drone to assist the rover in finding nearby things to find or to survey the land, because you don't want the rover suddenly coming up against something that might injure it or might get in trouble. And yes, we have a few examples here on the website talking about how it found like this outcrop over here that the rover is going to go and investigate. It's called Fortin Ridge due to a resemblance to a parish. And yeah, it can also do science on its own as well. So it can fly up and look at the size of a crater and try to figure out what is going on with said surface features from a large perspective, from a high up perspective, before the rover gets a deep down close look at it. So yeah, this may be a standard feature of future space missions.
Oh, good. Yeah. All right. And Alan's got COVID.
Well, not actually infected with COVID, which is a good thing, because it turns out that Omicron, the variant of SARS that is quote unquote mild, is not mild. This, according to a study that's just been released, it's a preprint, has not been reviewed yet. But the authors looked at the electronic health records of a large healthcare system, which is unnamed, including 13 hospitals in the state of Massachusetts. And then they applied a number of controls to determine whether or not the people who were coming to the hospital or these hospitals and were infected, not just coming to the hospitals, but people in Massachusetts in general who were infected with Omicron had better or worse outcomes than previous waves from previous variants of the coronavirus. And this is a very, very tricky thing because there's so many confounders. If you've been previously infected, then your subsequent infections are probably going to be milder. If you've already been vaccinated, then you're definitely going to have a milder case. And then there are other issues such as comorbidities, like do you have high blood pressure? Do you have diabetes, et cetera, et cetera? If you do have those conditions, then you're more likely to have a worse outcome. Well, so it's a very, very complex thing. And early on in the Omicron outbreak in South Africa, there was a lot of talk about, oh, well, it's not so bad. The hospitalization rate's not very bad at all. And not that many people are dying now compared to like the beta wave that South Africa had a year prior. And so that gave rise to this narrative about Omicron is mild, Omicron is mild.
Yeah.
This new variant is milder than the previous variants. And that turns out to be false. This analysis finds that when you adjust for all those different confounders, that it's just as bad. And so maybe people aren't coughing up a lung with Omicron, but they're still having bad outcomes. It's a very pernicious virus, and it can kill in many different ways, and it can damage in many different ways. And their analysis finds that it's just as bad as all the others. It's the only reason why it didn't kill more people, and it killed an awful lot of people, is that so many people in America already had some prior form of immunity, albeit weak immunity oftentimes.
It seems like this is mostly relevant for China.
Yes,
Yeah.
it absolutely is. And although China is an interesting case too, in that the population of China was widely vaccinated, but with the Sinovac vaccine,
Right.
which is shown to be vastly inferior to the mRNA vaccines.
Yeah.
So it's actually not very protective at all. And the Chinese government made a huge error in not trying to update the vaccines or in buying doses from Moderna and Pfizer.
Yeah, that's their zero COVID strategy. They think they don't need vaccination because they'll just stop it from spreading.
Right. And which is not necessarily a bad strategy, given the potential for the long COVID consequences. But when you're dealing with such an infectious disease, I mean, it is an extraordinarily infectious disease at this point, almost up to measles level, which is the all-time champ. It becomes extremely difficult to follow this zero COVID strategy, just because it's always going to leak out.
Yeah, I mean, everybody in Shanghai has been locked down for a month.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And so I found an article in the New York Post, which I didn't normally read, but they had some good stuff in here. And they had a list of 5 professors that got canceled, including one that went off to found that special school in Austin for teachers who want more free speech. And they had pretty good stories here. One I sort of how these people got canceled and how they felt abused and fought for their position, largely didn't get it. This is a real thing at colleges. I've seen 3 people in my own department fired and blacklisted for very minor offenses. There's a whole bunch of third rails in academia, and if you step on the wrong rail, blam, they just blast you. And like one person here had he was teaching like a linguistics course about offensive language, and he was talking about offensive words. And so they reported him for using offensive words and fired him for using offensive words. And he said, I've been teaching the same course for 20 years, the same way, and suddenly they're firing me, which does seem to, I hear a lot from other people, other professors. This is a real thing. It's everybody is very touchy now in a way they didn't used to be, and you get in trouble easily. So Of course, I'm always very careful and meek and mild and inoffensive, non-controversial in my statements, so I'm safe. But these people all managed to step on a third rail and get in trouble. Anyway, and
Although
then,
it should be said for the record, I don't know about all three of these instructors, former instructors in the department, but I do know about one of them. And what he said, from what I understand, what he said to a student in the classroom was absolutely, totally unacceptable. And he should have been fired for that.
oh, okay. Well, one thing, by the way, about the rules of the college is you're never allowed to mention this. And you're never allowed to talk about what they did. That's one of the rules.
Hmm.
So you're in trouble.
Oh well, they're going to can me anyway.
That's right. Anyway, and so Kaitlyn has got TikTok.
Well, TikTok, the TikTok generation, I should say.
Mhm.
So SF Gate, which is a local paper for us. It's the San Francisco Chronicle, pretty much. It has an article written by, who's this by? Joshua Boat, or is it Bote? We'll never know. It's the true man of mystery, the reporter of mystery. So there have always been these schemes to get consumers to buy more than they can afford through buy now, pay later type schemes. So you've seen it a lot back when there were advertisements on TV for, you've seen on TV products where you would buy it in 4 easy payments of $39.95 as opposed to 4 times 40, which would be $160. I mean, they don't put up the price, the full price. They make it seem like you can afford it by splitting it up, and the human brain kind of doesn't do the math so much, and that you can sometimes buy much more than you can afford. And a lot of this targeting now is done through online realtors. So there are companies like Affirm, and they're listed here in the article. So I'm just going to read off the article: Klarna, Sezler, Zip, Afterpay, and like I said, Affirm. Affirm's the one I know of anyway. And a lot of younger people, especially very young, like Gen Z, they're just getting out of college, they're just going on their own. They're trying to make their way in the world, and they see people who have, they'll go on TikTok and they'll buy like Gucci bags and stuff and say, look, I only bought this for $20 a month, and I now have the best Gucci bag and the best clothes, and I'm just going to be the belle of the ball, and it's like practically free, and I didn't have to spend $300. I just spent 3 easy payments of $100. And it fools a lot of people. So, and yeah, they talk about the joke where it's technically free. It's not free, and a lot of people are going into debt. And a lot of younger people not only have to deal with this kind of predatory consumer lending, but also having to deal with student loans
Right.
and other financial burdens when they're young, which they didn't used to have to do that. So it looks like there's probably going to be some regulation on this stuff, because it is becoming a bit of a problem. A lot of the lending companies that are doing this, the pay, buy now, pay later type stuff, have extremely large APRs. So they'll they talk about 30% APR loans for buying a Gucci bag or something. And unless you're very skilled and know a lot about finances, you could be getting yourself into some real hot water using some of these services. And like I said, they really do prey on younger, less knowledgeable people who get trapped in these cycles of debt.
Yeah.
So
I know this happens to everybody, commonly around credit card debt. And I was listening to a podcast yesterday from these crypto people, and this one guy was being criticized, saying, they say you're a crook and you just pulled the rug out on these people. And he said, well, I started in respectable finance. I was doing payday loans, and then I moved into crypto. And I was thinking, that's not a big leap at all.
that is not a big leap at all. Payday loans are the other big thing. For people who don't know what a payday loan is, have you ever seen those loans, get your paycheck early? Yeah. Like get your paycheck. Like if you need money now,
Yeah.
you can go to these little stores and get you know, they'll give you your paycheck now as opposed to on the 15th or whatever. That's called a payday loan. They are super predatory. They're like loan sharks.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very nasty.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I had to give anyone some advice, and I'm kind of lucky, but I've been in financial situations where I've not been particularly wealthy, but I stayed away from debt like the plague. I mean, if it took me like, I had debt and it took me like years to pay it off, but I just did it slowly and I just didn't use my credit card and, but you just buy what you can afford, and don't never leave it up to credit cards and paying it off over time if you can, and if there's something you really want, save up for it.
Yeah. I think it's really awful the way students have to pay enormous amounts and go into a huge debt to get their college degree. That's just giving a really poor start in life, especially these days when it's so hard to find a job.
You're a socialist communist now, Sam.
Well, yeah, I think college should be affordable, and your kids shouldn't start out with a lot of debt. So there you go. So here I am being
Yep.
wildly inconsistent as usual. All right. Well, that's it for this one, and we'll be back on Tuesday.